Welcome to Something About Sleep. We hope you'll let our stories guide you to a nice, peaceful slumber as you learn about history and what it was like to be a human in times long since past. Now, I need to get to sleep, and if you're watching this video, chances are you do too. So, without further ado, take it away.
Thank you, sir. On tonight's episode, we will explore life along the Nile during the flood season. So join me here by the fire and rest your weary eyes as I tell you a tale from long, long ago. Before our journey along the Nile begins, imagine a river in the quiet hour before sunrise. The sky is still dark, the stars are fading slowly, and the water moves northward in a broad, patient current. At the edge of the bank, reeds lean together in the faint night breeze. A small boat rests against its rope. The mud near the shore is cool, dark, and marked with footprints that the river may soften before morning is fully here. Somewhere in this dimness, a person notices the first true sign that the season has changed. It may be a boatman checking a knot before the village wakes. It may be a woman stepping outside with a jar and seeing that the familiar path to the water has grown shorter. It may be a child, not yet old enough to understand calendars or official records, who sees that the river has climbed a little higher against the bank than it did the day before. In a world so closely shaped by water, such small changes mattered. Tonight, we're going to follow the Nile during the season the ancient Egyptians called Akhet, the inundation. We will not rush toward the most famous monuments, and we will not tell the story through kings alone. Instead, we will stay close to the riverbank, close to ordinary houses, low fields, storage jars, reed mats, cattle pens, ferry boats, temple courtyards, and the soft sounds of a village waiting for the land to become water. There is a gentle mystery in this season. To people far away from the river, a flood might sound like an interruption, something that arrives against the usual order of life. But in ancient Egypt, the annual rise of the Nile was part of the expected rhythm of the year. It did not mean that every flood was perfect, or that every community experienced it in exactly the same way. Some years may have brought too much water and others too little, but in the broad pattern of Egyptian life, the inundation was watched, measured, hoped for, worked around, and folded into the habits of households, fields, temples, and officials. To live beside the Nile during Akhet was to live with a calendar that could be seen and heard. Time was not only marked by dates, festivals, or the names of rulers. It was marked by the height of water against a bank, by the dampness of soil underfoot, by the movement of boats across places where people had recently walked, and by the long pause before fields could be worked again. The year seemed to breathe in and out with the river. We should be careful as we enter this world. Ancient Egypt lasted for thousands of years, and the details of daily life shifted across dynasties, regions, occupations, and households. A village in Upper Egypt was not the same as a town in the Delta. The experience of a farmer was not the same as that of a priest, a scribe, a herder, or a boatman. The evidence left to us is rich, but it is also uneven. Tomb scenes, administrative records, archaeological remains, religious texts, tools, houses, and later observations all offer clues, yet they do not preserve every voice. So tonight, we will move with care, using what is widely supported while allowing room for uncertainty where the evidence asks for it. For now, picture an unnamed village on slightly higher ground near the river. The houses are built of mud brick, their walls softened by weather and repaired by familiar hands. Roofs may hold baskets, mats, jars, and small household tasks waiting for cooler hours. Nearby, there are places for animals, places for grinding grain, places for cooking, washing, mending, storing, and resting. Beyond the houses, the fields lie lower, ready to receive the water. Farther still, the desert edge remains quiet and pale, a different world of stone, dryness, burials, roads, and distant horizons. As the river rises, ordinary boundaries begin to change. A path that once crossed a field disappears beneath shallow water. A ridge that marked one plot from another becomes an island of dark earth. The soundscape changes too. There is more lapping water, more creaking rope, more movement of boats, more birds along the wet places. Work does not vanish, but it changes shape. Farmers repair tools, tend animals, help with transport, assist on public projects when required, or turn to other household tasks while the low fields are covered. The flood season was also a time of measurement. The height of the Nile mattered deeply, because it was connected to expectations for the coming agricultural year. Nilometers, officials, scribes, and local knowledge all belonged to the long effort to understand what the river was doing. The exact systems varied across time and place, but the principle was simple enough to feel even now. Water height could shape grain, taxation, storage, travel, labour, and confidence. In a land where so much depended on the river's rhythm, watching the water was a practical act and in many ways a spiritual one. There was beauty in this season, but it was not the beauty of stillness alone. It was the beauty of adjustment. A doorway swept clean though the air remains damp. A jar lifted onto a higher shelf. A boat pushed from the bank in the first grey light. A scribe sharpening a reed pen before making a record. A temple servant carrying offerings through a courtyard where the morning air smells faintly of water, stone, smoke, and bread. A farmer standing in silence, not because nothing is happening, but because the most important work at that moment is to watch and wait. As we move through this story, you do not need to hold tightly to every name or term. Let them pass gently, like objects glimpsed by lamplight. Akhet is the inundation season. The Nile flows north toward the Mediterranean. Winds could help boats travel south. Rich silt settled over low fields. Mud brick houses stood where people hoped the water would not reach. Temples connected practical life with sacred meaning. Villages adapted their routines to a river that was both familiar and never completely under human control. We will begin with the land itself, because the flood cannot be understood apart from the shape of Egypt. A green ribbon beside a river, bordered by desert, organised by water, labour, memory, and patience. From there, we will move through the seasons, the first signs of the rising river, the village on higher ground, the work of households, boats and transport, temple life, marshes, animals, craft work, receding water, and the quiet return to fields darkened by silt. And before we follow the river farther into that landscape, you're warmly invited to leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. If this kind of calm history helps you relax, you can also like the video and subscribe for more gentle journeys into the past. To understand life during the flood season, we first need to picture the land before the water spreads across it. Ancient Egypt was not an endless green country. It was, in many places, a narrow cultivated ribbon beside a river, bordered by desert that could seem very close. From above, the settled world might appear as a long thread of palms, fields, canals, villages and paths stretched along the Nile's course. On either side the colour changed. The valley floor held dark soil and human labour. The desert rose dry, pale and quiet beyond it. The Egyptians themselves used powerful contrast to describe this world. The fertile cultivated land was often associated with black earth, the rich alluvial soil renewed by the river. The surrounding desert could be imagined as red land, a place of dryness, distance, burial grounds, minerals, travel, danger, and sacred meanings. These ideas varied through time and text, but the contrast was real enough in daily experience. A person standing near a field could often look one way and see green growth, then look another and see the desert edge waiting in the light. This closeness shaped how people moved and settled. Much of ordinary life gathered near the water because the river gave access to drinking water, transport, fertile soil, fish, reeds, clay, and mud for brick making. Villages could sit on slightly raised ground, safer from the annual inundation than the low fields, while paths followed higher strips of earth between houses, canals, and enclosures. In some places, limestone cliffs or desert hills pressed toward the valley. In others, the land opened toward broader floodplain or farther north into the many branches and marshy spaces of the delta. The delta deserves its own quiet imagination. There, in the north, the river divided and spread into a wider fan before reaching the Mediterranean. It was a land of channels, damp fields, settlements, papyrus, birds, fish, and changing waterways. But for our journey tonight, we will mostly remain with a smaller riverside community somewhere along the valley, not because every Egyptian lived in such a place, but because one village lets us listen more closely. A large history can sometimes become sleepier, gentler, and more human when it is held inside one small set of houses. The river itself moved from south to north, flowing down toward the sea. This can feel opposite to the way maps sometimes train our eyes, but to the people of the Nile Valley it was a fact of movement. The current carried boats northward. At the same time, prevailing winds could often help sailing craft move southward, their sails filling as they worked against the current. This combination made the Nile not only a source of water, but a road, a line of communication, and a practical link between regions. Imagine travelling slowly along it. The boat passes low banks where cattle stand near the edge, their legs half reflected in the water. It passes clusters of date palms and dom palms, gardens near houses, and fields divided by banks and channels. It passes men repairing a wall, women carrying baskets, children standing in the shade, and a dog lifting its head as the boat slides by. Farther back, mud brick houses catch the morning light, their walls made from the same earth that the river season after season helps to sustain. Beyond the village, the desert remains visible. It is not empty in an absolute sense. People crossed it, quarried stone from it, buried their dead in its dry ground, travelled through its roots, and imagined it in religious and symbolic ways. Yet for the farmer watching floodwater rise, the desert could also be a boundary. It showed where the river's gift became thin. It made the green strip feel precious. In a land where the difference between cultivated soil and dry stone could be seen so plainly, water became not an abstract resource but a presence. During most of the year, field paths, irrigation channels, boundary ridges, and low embankments gave shape to this cultivated world. People knew where one plot ended and another began. They knew which path led to a neighbour's threshing floor, which ditch held water longest, which bank needed repair, and which grove made shade in the afternoon. But Akhet changed this familiar map. As the Nile rose, the lowest land began to vanish. Edges blurred. A path that had been dusty in one season might become a narrow causeway, then a line underwater, then a memory beneath a reflective surface. This transformation was not the same everywhere, and not every patch of land behaved alike. Some fields were lower, some higher. Some basins filled more readily than others. Local knowledge mattered. A farmer might know a field not from abstract measurement alone, but from years of walking it, placing a foot on its ridges, watching the water settle there, remembering how the soil dried after a good flood. The land was not a flat stage. It was a known body, with dips, banks, paths, trees, and habits. So as dawn grows stronger over our imagined village, we can look out from a low roof and see the long green ribbon waiting to be remade. The river flows in the centre, but it is connected to everything around it. The clay in the walls, the grain in the jars, the fibres in the ropes, the reeds in the baskets, the root of a ferry, the offering bowl in a temple, and the sleeping fields beyond the houses. To follow flood season is to follow the way a whole landscape breathes, and once the land is in our mind, we can begin to notice time. Not clock time, not hurried time, but the slow circular time of rising water, emerging soil, growing crops, harvest heat, and waiting. The Nile Valley was a place, but it was also a rhythm. The next step in our journey is to listen to that rhythm as the ancient year turns. Far to the south, the Nile entered Egypt through regions marked by cataracts, rocky stretches, islands, and older borderlands where trade, military movement, and cultural exchange could take place. We do not need to travel there tonight in detail, but it helps to remember that the river was long before it reached any one village. The water that passed a field in Middle Egypt had already moved through landscapes beyond that farmer's site. News, goods, officials, travellers, and stories could follow the same long line, making the river a thread of distance as well as a local source of life. The valley's narrowness could make everyday geography intimate. A person might walk from house to field, from field to canal, from canal to desert edge, in a relatively short time depending on location. This closeness did not make the world small. It made the contrast sharper. The cultivated land required labour and water. The desert preserved tombs, offered stone, and opened routes to oases, mines, and neighbouring regions. Between the two, the village lived in a middle zone, close enough to the river to depend on it, high enough to endure its seasonal rise. The delta, though we keep it mostly in the distance, complicates the picture beautifully. It was not just a flat northern ending to the river. Its channels shifted over long periods. Marshes, fields, and settlements formed a broader water world where boats could move along branching routes and where papyrus, fish, fowl, and agriculture all mattered. A person from the valley might imagine the delta as wide and wet, while someone from the delta might know its many channels as intimately as a valley farmer knew one basin and one bank. This geography shaped building as well. Mud brick made sense in a river valley where clay, silt, chopped straw, sun, and labour were available. Stone was used for temples, tombs, monuments, and elite structures, but ordinary houses were often built from earth. This meant that settlements could weather, erode, be rebuilt, and leave lighter traces than stone monuments. The landscape of living people was more fragile than the landscape of the dead, which is one reason the past often appears to us through tombs while the village must be reconstructed with care. Even roads belonged to the river's logic. Paths ran along banks between fields and toward landings. In dry seasons, a person might walk easily where Achet later placed water. A donkey might carry loads along a ridge that, in flood time, became unusable. A boat landing might become more important when the fields spread into reflective basins. The map was not fixed in one season. It breathed, narrowed, opened, and shifted. To live here was to know not only where things were, but when they could be reached. The light itself helped define this geography. Morning might come first to the cliffs or desert slopes, while the valley floor remained blue and cool. Later, the fields brightened, the river flashed, and the mud-brick walls turned warm. By evening, the desert could glow while the cultivated land fell into shade. People living here would have known these daily changes intimately. The flood season did not erase them. It added a second light. The light reflected upward from water lying over the fields, so that sky seemed to rest below the village as well as above it. In ancient Egypt, the agricultural year is often described through three broad seasons: Akhet, Pere, and Shemu. These terms are useful, though the exact relationship between ancient months and modern dates can vary depending on period, region, and the way scholars discuss calendars. For a sleep story, it is enough to hold the pattern gently. Akhet was the time of inundation, when the Nile rose and spread across low fields. Pere was the time of emergence and growing, when the waters withdrew and crops took root. Shemu was the hotter harvest season, when grain was cut, stored, counted, and carried. The beauty of this pattern is that it is simple without being shallow. Water arrives, land disappears, water withdraws, soil emerges, seeds go in, green shoots rise, grain ripens, heat deepens, harvest comes, storage fills. The year turns again toward waiting. For people whose work depended on fields, animals, canals, and stored food, these were not merely names for seasons. They were expectations held in the body. They shaped tools, conversations, obligations, meals, and the kind of work a household prepared to do. The civil calendar used in ancient Egypt included 12 months of 30 days, with 5 additional days at the end of the year. Scholars discuss details of calendars across Egypt's long history, and the relationship between civil time, agricultural observation, and religious festivals can be complex. But the river offered another kind of calendar, one that could be seen from the bank. A person did not need to read a written date to notice that the water was touching a lower step, then a higher one, or that the edge of a field had become too soft to cross. Older people in a village may have remembered floods from earlier years. They might speak of a season when the water lingered longer in a certain basin, or a year when a bank needed extra work, or a time when a field dried quickly and planting had to move with care. Such remembered details are difficult to recover from evidence, but the habit of comparing seasons is deeply human and historically plausible. Agriculture is made of memory. It is made of noticing, repeating, adjusting, and passing small knowledge from one generation to another. Akhet did not mean that everyone stopped working. It meant the kind of work changed. Ploughing and sowing waited for the proper time. The fields lay under water or stayed too damp for ordinary cultivation. But households still needed bread. Animals still needed care. Nets, baskets, ropes, tools, boats, storage spaces, and banks needed attention. People might be involved in transport, maintenance, local obligations, craft work, or tasks connected to estates, temples, or administrative systems. The flood paused some labours while opening others. Pere, the emergence season, carried a different feeling. As water withdrew, the dark soil appeared again. moist and fertile. The land did not simply return as it had been. Boundaries might need to be recognised again. Ditches, basins and banks might need checking. Seeds could be prepared, animals yoked, tools brought out from shade, and the first green of the next cycle imagined before it appeared. Pere was the answer to the waiting of Akhet, not in the form of sudden reward, but in the steady beginning of work. Shemu, the harvest season, came later, when fields that had once been underwater stood dry and golden. Grain was cut with sickles, carried, threshed, winnowed, stored and counted. Heat and dust belonged to this part of the year. So did relief, labour, obligation and calculation. The grain harvest could be linked to taxation, rations, temple and palace economies, household security and social exchange. Yet in our story tonight, Shemu remains in the distance, like a memory from the previous year and a promise far ahead. The ancient Egyptian year, then, was not only a chain of months, it was a conversation between water and work. People read the year through smells as much as through signs: damp mud, cut straw, warm bread, drying linen, stored grain, smoke in courtyards, and the sharp greenness of plants after the water had receded. They heard it in insects, frogs, birds, cattle, boat ropes, grinding stones, and the murmur of people talking quietly at dawn. Because the flood was generally expected, it might be tempting to imagine it as perfectly predictable. But nature rarely fits human plans so neatly. Ancient people could expect the season and still watch with attention. They could trust the old rhythm while knowing that details mattered. Too little water or too much could bring difficulties, and communities had to adapt. For this episode, we keep that truth softly in the background, not as a disaster story, but as part of the real seriousness beneath calm routines. Now, as Akhet approaches in our imagined village, the circular year begins to narrow into the present moment. People are no longer speaking only about what usually happens. They are watching what is happening now. The river has risen a little, then a little more. Somewhere far to the south, the flood has already made itself known. Downstream, people wait for its message in the water. They look at marks, steps, banks, and old records. The year measured in water is becoming visible. The annual rhythm of the Nile was also linked in some periods and interpretations with celestial observation. The heliacal rising of Sirius, known to the Egyptians as Sopdet, has long been discussed by scholars because of its relationship to the Egyptian calendar and the season of inundation. We should avoid making this connection too neat for all times and places, but it is a beautiful reminder that the year could be watched both below and above. The river rose on earth while the sky carried its own signs, and people living close to both could feel the world as a set of returning patterns. Calendars are practical, but they are also emotional. A month name or season name can gather memories around it. Akhet might call to mind damp banks, fuller channels, boats tied higher, frogs at night, work moved into shade, and the feeling of a field gone temporarily out of reach. Pere might call to mind the smell of new soil, the first urgent labour after waiting, and the sight of green growth against dark earth. Shemu might carry heat, dust, grain, threshing floors, and the satisfaction and strain of harvest. In a village, the calendar would not belong only to officials or priests. It would be taught through tasks. Children would learn that certain work comes after other work, that certain tools are brought out only when the ground is ready, that a jar must be watched because the next harvest is not yet here, and that a path may be safe in one season and foolish in another. Time entered the hands before it entered explanation. A child carrying a small bundle during a chet was learning the year without needing a lesson. Because ancient Egyptian history covers such a long span, it is helpful to think of Achet, Pere, and Shemu as an organizing framework rather than a rigid scene identical everywhere. Different regions experienced water differently. The delta did not behave exactly like a narrow valley basin. A community near a major temple might experience the season through different obligations than a smaller settlement. Yet the three-part rhythm remains one of the clearest ways to imagine how farming, storage, labour, and expectation were arranged around the Nile. The year also moved through social life. Marriages, festivals, work assignments, deliveries, building tasks, and travel could all be shaped by season. A boat trip easier in one water condition might be difficult in another. A labour demand that made sense when fields were underwater might be impossible during harvest. A household visit might be planned around paths and river crossings. Time was not simply passing overhead. It was woven into the question of who could go where, who owed what, and what work could be done. The 5 extra days at the end of the civil calendar, sometimes called epagamenal days by modern scholars, were connected in Egyptian tradition with divine births and religious meaning, though details belong to more specialized discussion. For our purposes, their existence reminds us that calendar time was not only agricultural but also sacred and administrative. The year had edges, thresholds, and named moments. Yet even with calendars and ceremonies, the river kept its own slow authority. A date might arrive, but the soil still had to be ready. There is a particular kind of silence that comes from watching something slow and important. It is not empty silence. It is full of attention. During the approach of Akhet, people along the Nile would have watched the river in many ways. Some looked from the bank as part of daily habit. Some watched because their work depended on what the water might do. Officials, priests, scribes, farmers, boatmen, and householders could all care about the river height, though not always for the same reasons. In some places, structures known as nilometers were used to measure the level of the Nile. A well-known preserved example is at Elephantine Island near Aswan, though there were other measuring places and practices across periods. These devices could be stairways, shafts, or marked structures that allowed observers to track the rising water. The idea is simple and quietly powerful. The river, which seems so large and living, is being read by marks on stone. One mark touched by water might mean expectation. Another might mean preparation. Another might become part of a record. Let us imagine a measuring place in the soft morning. Stone steps descend toward the water. The air is cool inside the shaded opening. A priest, an official, or a trained observer stands near the marks. A scribe waits with his writing materials. The water has climbed since yesterday. It laps at a line that was dry before. The sound is small, not dramatic. A little slap of water against stone, a drip from a damp edge, a reed pen prepared for use. Yet the meaning of that small sound could spread through fields, storehouses, and calculations. Scribes are sometimes imagined only as elegant figures in tomb paintings, seated cross-legged with palettes and scrolls. But their work could be practical and deeply connected to everyday systems. They recorded quantities, labour, deliveries, land information, offerings, and stores. In relation to the flood, measurements and expectations could matter for planning and assessment, including taxation or estimates of later agricultural output, although details changed across Egypt's long history. A scribe's quiet notation might be part of a chain connecting water level to future grain. The tools of writing were physical things: reed pens, ink, pallets, papyrus in some contexts, and also writing on ostraca, which are pieces of pottery or limestone used for notes and records. We can imagine a scribe smoothing a surface, dipping a pen, listening as a number is spoken, then making signs carefully in black ink. Around him, people may not think of the act as mysterious. It is skilled, respected and necessary, but also work. The scratch of the pen is one more sound in the season. Farmers watching the water might not need the formal measure to know that the land was changing, but official records and local observation could exist side by side. A farmer sees the bank where his children walked becoming slippery. He notices that a low ridge at the edge of a field has vanished. He watches driftwood touch a clump of reeds that was dry last week. He may ask someone who has heard news from farther upstream. He may listen to older neighbours comparing this year's rise with one they remember. There is no need to make this scene fearful. Concern and attention are enough. Flood season involved uncertainty, but it also belonged to a known cycle. A man might stand at the edge of the water with a child beside him and say that the river is coming well, or he might say that it is still early, or perhaps he says nothing, because the water itself is answering slowly. In sleep history, we can let the pause remain. Not every thought needs to be explained. Measurement also made the river social. The flood was not only what one household saw from one bank, it became news. It travelled by boat, by officials, by temple networks, by market talk, by relatives visiting from a nearby settlement. People asked how high the water was at a certain place, whether a canal had begun to fill, whether a boat could pass, whether a field road was still open. The river connected villages not only through transport but through shared anticipation. At the same time, we should remember that ancient Egypt was not uniform. Practices varied by era, by region, by administrative setting, and by social status. A royal estate, a temple domain, a larger town and a small village could experience organization differently. Our scene is a plausible reconstruction, not a claim that every Egyptian watched the flood in the same way. What remains steady is the underlying truth. Water level mattered. People observed it, spoke about it, and built routines around its rise and fall. By late afternoon, the measuring place is warmer. Light leans across the stone. The scribe's record has been stored. The official has gone. A farmer has returned to his house. The river continues without hurry. It touches one mark, then another, not because it knows the marks are there, but because human beings have placed their attention beside it. The valley listens, and the measured rise becomes visible beyond the measuring place. Water moves into ditches, low paths, and the first edges of the fields. The act of measuring water joins two ways of knowing: the bodily knowledge of people who live beside the river, and the formal knowledge of institutions that record and compare. A farmer might know by smell, by the softness of a bank, by the behaviour of animals, or by the place where water touches a familiar tree root. A temple or administrative centre might know by a mark on stone, a recorded level, or a report sent from upstream. Neither kind of knowledge cancels the other. Together they make the flood season legible. At Elephantine near Aswan, preserved nilometer remains help modern visitors imagine this older attention to water. The island's location near Egypt's southern reaches made it especially meaningful for observing the river before its effects travelled farther north. But it would be misleading to imagine one single measuring point controlling every experience of the flood. Reports, local observations and administrative practices existed within networks. The water rose in a real river, not in a diagram, and people responded at many scales. There may have been ceremonial meaning around the rise as well as practical accounting. In an Egyptian worldview where nature, kingship, temple ritual and cosmic order could be linked, the flood's proper arrival was not just an agricultural fact. It could be part of the order people hoped to maintain. Still, the official language of the order should not make us forget the practical eyes watching the bank. A person responsible for a storage room might think of grain. A boatman might think of landing places. A farmer might think of soil. The river's rise would have been discussed in ordinary speech. Imagine a conversation held in the shade while someone repairs a rope. One person says that the water has reached the old mark near the tamarisk. Another says the southern report sounded promising. A third remembers a year when the water climbed quickly after a slow beginning. None of these voices survives in a text, but they are plausible because people everywhere talk about the conditions that shape their work. Weather talk, river talk, crop talk, and memory talk are among the oldest forms of human conversation. A scribe's record could turn that talk into something more durable. He might not write the farmer's worry or the child's wonder, but he could preserve a number, a delivery, a quantity, a name, or an obligation. The surviving record is often thinner than the lived moment, yet it gives historians a doorway. Behind every neat line of ancient writing, there may have been heat, dust, voices, wet sandals, and the smell of river mud. The ink is quiet, but the world around it was alive. There is also patience in repeated measurement. One reading means little without comparison. Yesterday's level, last week's level, older records, remembered floods, and downstream reports all give the number its meaning. A mark on stone becomes useful because people return to it again and again. This repeated returning is almost meditative. Step down, look, listen, record, compare, step back. In the quiet routine of measurement, we can feel how ancient societies turned natural change into shared knowledge. The first arrival of water into the fields may be almost too gentle to notice from a distance. A ditch darkens, a low channel brightens, a patch of earth that had held hoof prints becomes glossy and soft. Then, over days and weeks, the change widens. The Nile does not merely stay within the line where people last saw it. It reaches outward through natural low places and managed channels into basins and fields shaped by human work and seasonal habit. The land begins to reflect the sky. In many descriptions of ancient Egyptian agriculture, basin irrigation is important. Put simply, earthen banks and field divisions could help water enter certain areas, remain there long enough to soak the soil and deposit silt, and then drain or recede when the season changed. The details varied across time and place, and scholars continue to examine how local landscapes were managed. But the basic idea is easy to imagine. People did not merely watch water wander without thought. They worked with banks, channels, and basins so the flood could nourish the land. As the water spreads, field boundaries soften. A ridge still exists beneath the surface, but the eye no longer reads it clearly. A footpath between plots becomes a line of ripples, then vanishes. The place where barley or emmer wheat would later grow is now a shallow expanse of brown gold water. Palm trunks stand reflected upside down. Mud brick houses on higher ground seem to float above their own mirrored shapes. A clump of reeds trembles in the current where dry dust had been. This is the visual heart of Akhet. The fields are not lost but sleeping. They are covered so they can return changed. The river carries fine mineral-rich silt from far away, and as the water slows across the floodplain, that silt settles. It darkens the soil. It helps renew fertility. The water also gives moisture that will matter when planting begins. To people who depended on the fields, the submerged land was both absence and promise. The work of sowing could not yet begin, but the condition for later work was being made. Still, we should not imagine the flood as perfect every year. Too little water could leave fields thirsty and yields poor. Too much water could cause difficulty, especially if settlements, stores or banks were affected. Ancient texts sometimes reflect anxiety about inadequate inundation, and practical concern would have been real. But tonight we will not dwell there. We're following a balanced flood season, the kind that arrives with seriousness but also with relief. The river rises enough to cover the low fields and set the year in motion. People adjust. A farmer moves a tool from one storage place to another. A family ties a boat higher because yesterday's knot now hangs too low. Animals are brought away from wet ground to safer pens and higher paths. Someone lifts a basket from a wall niche and checks whether the grain inside is dry. Children are warned not to run along a softened bank. A woman steps carefully where mud grips her heel. A neighbour calls across a lane that the lower path is no longer passable. The sounds change as much as the view. The dry scratch of feet on dust becomes the soft pull of mud. Frogs begin to call at night from places that had been silent. Insects gather near water. Boat poles touch submerged ground with muffled taps. The lowing of cattle carries across open water farther than it did across fields. At evening, the village hears the river everywhere, not as a roar, but as a surrounding quiet, a slow presence pressing close around the houses. From a rooftop, the transformation is clearer. A person standing in the last light can see where field, ditch and path have become one reflective plain. The desert beyond remains dry and pale, reminding the eye how sharp the boundary of life can be. Between desert and village, water holds the colour of the sky. It turns rose, then grey, then a deep brown darkness. The tops of low banks may still appear as broken lines. A tree stands alone with water around its roots. The land has become a shallow sea. For a sleep narration, this image invites us to slow down. We do not need to hurry past it. The same field that would later be busy with ploughs, sowing, birds, children and harvest is quiet now. Its furrows are hidden. Its names are held in memory. The people know the land is still there, just beneath the surface. They know where the ridges lie, where the soil deepens, where one family's plot meets another. But for a little while, the field belongs to the river, and because the fields are covered, village life gathers more tightly on higher ground. The ordinary centre of the day shifts inward, toward courtyards, doorways, roofs, pens, storage rooms, and shaded work. Smoke rises from houses, bread is made, linen is mended, jars are checked. The floodwater reflects the village walls, but inside those walls the season continues in quieter forms. The transformation of fields into water also changed the scale of sound. When standing on dry land, sound breaks against walls, banks, crops, animals, and uneven ground. When water spreads, it carries voices differently. A call from one house to another may seem to travel farther. The knock of a boat against a post may be heard clearly at dusk. Birds may lift from one flooded edge and settle on another, their wings making brief patterns over what had recently been footpath and field. The colour of the water could shift throughout the day. In the morning it might look grey-blue under a pale sky, then brown where silt turns the surface opaque. then gold when the sun lowers, then nearly black at night. This brownness is important. It tells us the flood is not a clean decorative lake laid over the land. It is living water carrying earth, plant matter, and mineral richness. It is the river doing agricultural work before human hands return to the field. The banks that formed basins and channels were themselves products of work. They needed planning, maintenance, and local knowledge. People had to know where water should enter, where it should be held, and when a bank might be too weak. In some years, repairs could wait. In others, they became more urgent. We do not need to describe crisis. It is enough to notice that a good flood season depended partly on careful preparation before the water came and careful attention while it remained. Animals read the new landscape in their own way. Cattle hesitate near a softened bank. Goats test a raised path and are called back. Donkeys prefer firmer ground. Birds find insect where water reaches roots. Fish move into places that had been dry. A dog accustomed to running across a field now stops at the waterline, confused for a moment, then follows the higher lane instead. The flood alters not only human routes, but the small habits of every creature living near the village. There's also a mental adjustment. A farmer who sees his field underwater must hold two images at once, the visible water and the invisible land beneath it. He remembers the field's ridges, its low corner, its better soil, its stubborn weeds, its boundary with a neighbour. Flood water erases the surface without erasing the knowledge. In this sense, Achet is a season of memory. The land is hidden, but it is not forgotten. It rests in the minds of the people who will return to it. The covered fields also change the way people imagine distance. A neighbour's house that had once been reached by walking a path between plots might now require a boat or a longer route along higher ground. A storage place that seemed nearby in Shemu could feel separated during Achet. This did not make the community fall apart. It simply rearranged daily movement. People learned seasonal distances the way they learned seasonal work. Near and far were not fixed ideas. They changed with water. At the edge of the village, people also protect what must remain dry. Fuel, seed, tools, textiles, and stored food are moved away from damp corners. A low platform becomes useful. A shelf matters. A jar stopper is checked again. These domestic precautions are part of the flood landscape just as much as shining water is. The beauty of Achet rests beside practical vigilance, and the people who live with it know both feelings without separating them completely. Ancient Egyptian villages varied widely, and the evidence for ordinary houses depends on place and period. Still, mud brick was a common building material, and many homes were built with practical attention to heat, shade, storage, work, and family life. During flood season, a riverside settlement on slightly higher ground would feel especially important. The low fields might be underwater, paths altered and work rearranged, but the village itself remained a place of order. Walls, courtyards, roofs, thresholds, and storage rooms held the human world above the season's water. Imagine entering the village in the morning. The houses are the colour of dried earth, their edges softened by sun and use. Some walls have been patched where rain, time, or dampness left marks. Doorways open into small interiors or courtyards where work can be done in shade. Roofs are flat, useful for sleeping in hot weather, drying things, storing items, and watching the river. The village lanes are narrow. In some places they remain dry and dusty. In others, flood season has made them damp or changed the way people move through them. Inside a courtyard, grain is being ground. The sound is steady, stone moving against stone, not loud enough to disturb the morning, but constant enough to become part of it. Floor dust clings lightly to hands. Nearby, dough is mixed for bread. Beer, a common staple in many periods of ancient Egypt, may be prepared or stored in jars, though methods and household arrangements varied. Onions, legumes, fish, dates and other foods might appear in ordinary meals depending on season, region, availability and social standing. A household's possessions could be simple but full of texture. Pottery jars with rounded shoulders, reed mats laid over packed floors, baskets for carrying and storage, wooden stools, headrests in some contexts, linen cloth folded or hung, lamps waiting for evening, and tools set near a wall. Such objects tell a quieter history than monuments, but they are the kind of history that brings people close. A jar does not need to be royal to matter. A basket does not need an inscription to show labour, care and use. Not every household looked the same. Some families had more space, more goods, better storage, or closer ties to temples, estates, officials, or craft production. Others lived with less. A village could include labourers, farmers, herders, craft workers, boatmen, administrators, servants, and people whose roles shifted by season. It is important not to smooth these differences away. Yet even with differences of status, flood season touched many lives through the same broad realities. Fields under water, movement by boat, stored food, household labour, and waiting for the land to emerge. Children in the village experience Akhet differently from adults. To them, the flooded fields may be wonder, restriction, and play all at once. A familiar path is gone. A low tree seems to grow from water. A boat comes closer to the houses than usual. Adults tell them where not to step. They are given small tasks, carrying a light basket, watching a younger child, helping gather dried reeds, holding a cord while someone ties a bundle. Their world has become larger and smaller at the same time. Elders may sit in shade when the heat grows strong. They have seen the river rise many times. Perhaps they speak of old floods, older houses, a former bank, a field that once belonged to a relative, a year when a boat came late, or a time when the water lingered in a low place. We do not need to invent exact biographies. It is enough to imagine memory as part of the village atmosphere. A place is not only walls and paths. It is also what people remember while looking at the same water. Animals add their own rhythm. Goats shift in a pen. Cattle stand where the ground is firm. Donkeys flick their ears near a wall. Dogs move in and out of shade, half awake, half listening. Birds settle on roofs or near storage areas where grain dust might fall. During Akhet, keeping animals safe and fed could require planning, because ordinary grazing and field access changed. Fodder, tethering, higher ground, and careful movement became part of the season's practical intelligence. As the sun climbs, the village grows quieter. Heat presses against the mud brick walls. Work continues in shaded corners. A woman folds linen. A man repairs a basket rim. Someone turns a jar to check its seal. Another person stands on a roof and looks out over the shining fields. From there, the village feels like an island, though it is not truly cut off. Boats pass. Voices carry. Smoke rises. In the distance, the desert edge remains dry, still, and bright. By evening, lamps are lit. Small flames tremble in doorways. The smell of bread, smoke, damp earth, and animals mingles in the cooling air. The water around the village reflects the first stars. On higher ground, ordinary life continues, made quieter by the flood but not stopped. The fields are hidden for now, so the household becomes the centre of the world. To understand Achet more deeply, we can step through one doorway and listen to the slow domestic rhythm inside. The placement of a village was never accidental in a simple sense. People learned where water tended to reach, where older houses had stood, where the ground stayed firm, and where access to fields and river remained practical. Settlement patterns shifted over Egypt's long history, and archaeology shows that many living places were rebuilt, buried, or erased by later occupation. Yet the basic logic is understandable. A village needed closeness to work and water, but also enough height and firmness to remain livable when the flood rose. Flat roofs were especially useful in such a climate. At certain times of year, people could sleep on roofs to catch cooler air. Roofs could also hold stored items, drying materials, tools, or people watching the surroundings. During Achet, the roof becomes a quiet viewing place. From there, a child can see farther over the flooded fields than from the lane below. An adult can check whether a boat is coming. An older person can sit in evening air and watch light move across water that covers familiar ground. Mud brick walls had their own sensory presence. They held warmth after sunset and offered shade during the day. Their surfaces could be rough, patched, whitewashed in some contexts, or darkened by smoke and hand contact. A person leaning against such a wall would feel not the polished cold of stone temples, but the practical body of the house. The house was made of earth and straw, maintained by labour, and always in conversation with sun, damp, insects, people, and time. The village also had social geography. Some houses sat nearer to paths, landings, storage areas, or workspaces. Some households had stronger ties to certain families, officials, craft tasks, or institutions. During flood season, when movement changed, neighbours mattered. A person might borrow a rope, ask for help moving a jar, share news from a boatman, or call out when a lane becomes unsafe. The village was not a collection of isolated houses. It was a network of thresholds. Evenings on higher ground could be especially gentle. Heat leaves the walls slowly, smoke thins, water reflects lamps in wavering lines. People speak quietly because sound travels over the flooded land. A baby is rocked. A dog circles once before lying down. Someone on a roof looks at stars and wonders, perhaps how long until the first ridge appears. The village rests above the flood, but it is surrounded by its presence, held in a bowl of water and night. The village's smell would also change through the day. Morning carried ash, damp earth, animals and bread. Midday brought hot mud brick, dry straw, stored grain, and the faint sourness of beer jars or fermenting foods. Evening softened everything with smoke, cooler air, and the water smell rising from the floodplain. Smell is one of the quietest ways to enter history because it rarely appears in formal records. Yet for the people who lived there, the season would have been known through the nose as surely as through the eye. Inside the house, the flood season becomes small enough to hold in the hands. It is in the clay jar lifted from a storage corner, the linen folded across a lap, the grain ground before bread is baked, the reed mat shaken clean, the cord tightened around a bundle and the lamp checked before night. History often remembers Egypt through stone, kings, temples, and tombs, but the living day was also made of repeated household tasks. During Achet, when field labour changed, these tasks could become the quiet centre of time. Morning may begin with sweeping. Fine dust gathers even in a season of water because mud brick, earth floors, ash, chaff, and work all leave traces. A broom of plant fibres moves across a courtyard. A mat is lifted and shaken. A child is asked to carry a small pot out of the way. Someone checks whether a wool patch has dried. Another person lifts a lid from a jar, looks inside and replaces it carefully. The movements are practical, but they also make calm patterns. Bread making brings its own slow sequence. Grain must be ground, flour must be mixed, dough must rest or be shaped, depending on the method used. Ovens, moulds, hearths and baking practices varied over Egypt's long history, but bread was central to ordinary diet and economy. Beer, too, was a common staple in many contexts. Together, bread and beer appear again and again in texts, offerings, rations and images. In a household, they were not symbols first, they were nourishment. Linen belongs to another rhythm. Ancient Egypt is famous for linen, made from flax and cloth touched many parts of life. Clothing, household use, wrapping, trade, temple service, and status display. In an ordinary flood season household, we can imagine spinning, weaving, folding, patching, washing, or mending, though the exact division of work varied. A torn edge is turned under, a thread is pulled through, cloth is smoothed by hand. The action is small, but it carries care across time. We should speak cautiously about gender roles. Many household tasks were associated with women in ancient Egyptian imagery and scholarship, while men, women, children, servants, and specialists could all contribute to different kinds of work depending on household, class, and circumstance. Sleep history does not need rigid claims. It can show hands grinding grain, hands carrying water, hands knotting cord, hands mending cloth, hands shaping dough, hands lifting a child who has fallen asleep in shade. Pottery fills the house quietly. Jars store grain, beer, oil, water or other goods. Bowls hold food. Smaller vessels may contain ointments, pigments, or household materials. Some pottery is coarse and everyday, some finer, some reused, some broken and repurposed. A shard might become a writing surface in another setting. A vessel might be sealed with mud. In a world where storage mattered deeply, the jar was a kind of memory. It held what had been gathered before and what would be needed later. Water carrying does not disappear just because floodwater surrounds the village. Clean water, accessible water, and useful water still require human choices. A person might go to a safer bank, a well, a channel, or a known place where water can be drawn. The vessel is heavy when full. The path is watched carefully. At the threshold, water becomes cooking, washing, dampening clay, softening grain, cooling hands, or filling a jar for later. The Grand Nile becomes household water, one carried vessel at a time. In the afternoon, heat settles. The house becomes a shelter of shade. A child sleeps near a wall, one arm across a reed mat. Outside, someone speaks quietly to a neighbour. Inside, an older person checks a basket that has frayed along its rim. The repair is not urgent, but it is useful. Akhet allows certain repairs to come forward, because the usual field work waits. The season of water becomes, in part, a season of mending. At dusk, the house changes again. A lamp is lit, perhaps fueled with oil or fat, depending on context and means. Its flame makes the walls seem closer. Sounds outside become clearer. Frogs, insects, a dog near the doorway, water moving beyond the houses, a boatman's voice carrying from the bank. Food is shared. Someone closes a jar. Someone folds cloth. Someone steps onto the roof to feel the cooler air and look across the flooded fields. The household does not think of itself as a museum scene. It is simply living. Yet from a distance of thousands of years, these domestic rhythms are among the most intimate ways we can imagine the past. A temple inscription may tell us a ruler's name. A household object tells us that someone had to eat, rest, repair, store, carry, clean, and wait. When the fields lie underwater, those small acts continue. And beyond the doorway, the farmers who depend on those fields are also adjusting their work to the river's pace. Household life also included the care of the body. Combs, razors, oils, ointments, mirrors of polished metal in some contexts, and simple cosmetic materials are known from ancient Egypt, though access differed by status and period. In the quieter vaquette, someone might oil skin dried by sun, comb a child's hair, wash dust from hands, or fold a clean piece of linen for the next day. These details are not decorative extras. They remind us that ancient people lived in bodies that needed comfort, cleanliness, warmth, shade, and care. Meals could be simple and repetitive, but not meaningless. Bread broken by hand, beer poured from a jar, onions cut, lentils or beans cooked, fish roasted or dried, dates shared, or herbs added where available. The exact meal varies by household and era, but the feeling of eating at the end of the day is deeply human. Flood season may change outside labour, yet appetite remains. A person who spent the afternoon twisting rope still reaches for bread. A child still asks for more. Someone still saves a portion for later. Storage required constant judgment. How much grain remains? Which jar should be opened first? Is the seal still sound? Has dampness reached a corner? Are mice or insects a problem? The flood season, with fields out of use, made stored food more visible in the mind. This does not mean every household was anxious every day, but it does mean that jars and bins carried emotional weight. A full jar could make a room feel calmer. An emptying jar could make the future feel closer. Storytelling may have belonged to evenings as well. We should not invent a specific ancient tale and present it as known, but we can imagine the act of telling, a memory of a relative, a saying about the river, a humorous moment from a boat crossing, a lesson about where not to walk during Akhet, or a tale of gods and animals softened for children. Oral life leaves fewer traces than written records, but no society lives only by documents. Voices around a lamp are part of the history we must imagine carefully. Sleep itself is historical. Where people slept, how they arranged mats, whether they used headrests, how they cooled themselves, and how they responded to insects, animals, and night sounds all varied. In a flood season village, the night may be loud with frogs and insects, and the air may be damp near the water. A person lying on a roof hears boats, dogs, reeds, and low voices. The body rests inside the season as much as the mind does. Small forms of beauty belong to the household too. A clean fold in a linen garment, a painted line on a pot, a bead kept safe, a carefully swept threshold, a flower placed in water, or a mat woven with even tension could all bring order to ordinary space. Ancient Egyptian material culture shows a strong appreciation for pattern, proportion, and meaningful form. Even in a modest home, usefulness and beauty did not have to be enemies. A well-made basket could be both practical and pleasing. When we say the fields are under water, it can sound as though farming has stopped completely. But a farming life is larger than the moment of planting or harvest. It includes animals, tools, storage, banks, canals, obligations, repair, memory, and waiting. During Akhet, ploughing and sowing in the inundated floodplain had to wait until the waters withdrew and the soil was ready. Yet the people who worked the land were not idle. They were living inside a different part of the agricultural year. A farmer might begin the day by checking animals. Cattle, donkeys, goats, sheep and other animals had different roles depending on household and period, but animal care mattered. Grazing patterns could change when low fields and paths were covered. Fodder might need to be managed. Tethers, yokes, pens, and shelters needed attention. A wooden yoke might be examined for wear. A rope might be twisted tighter. A gate might be patched. These tasks are not dramatic, but they are the slow foundation of later work. Tools wait as well. Wooden ploughs, hoes, baskets, ropes, sickles and carrying frames all belong to the farming year. Sickle blades could be made with flint elements in earlier and many traditional forms, while metal elements appear in other contexts. The details depend on time and place. Rather than forcing one exact toolkit onto all of ancient Egypt, we can picture useful things kept ready in shade. A handle is smoothed. A cord is replaced. A basket is checked for weak spots before the heavier season returns. Banks and channels also require attention. The flood's usefulness depended in part on how water moved, where it stayed, and how it left. Local communities, estates and officials could be involved in maintaining irrigation features, though arrangements varied. A damaged bank might need repair when conditions allowed. A canal mouth might be checked. A silted passage might be noted for later work. Such labour reminds us that the Nile was not simply a miracle poured over passive fields. It was a natural force met by organised human effort. There may also have been obligations beyond a household's own plot. In different periods, some agricultural workers could be assigned to transport, maintenance, estate work, temple service, or larger labour projects, sometimes through systems scholars describe with terms such as corvée labour. We should be careful here. Not every farmer spent Akhet building monuments, and the details changed across time. But it is historically reasonable to see flood season as a time when labour could be redirected, especially when fields could not be worked in the usual way. In our village, one farmer sits in the shade repairing a wooden piece from a plough. He does not need to hurry because the land is not yet ready. Beside him, someone counts stored grain, not with elaborate ceremony, but with ordinary care. Nearby, a younger person twists rope from plant fibre, learning by watching. A basket of tools rests against a wall. Beyond the lane, the floodwater touches the foot of a palm. The fields are hidden, but farming continues in preparation. Waiting is not the same as doing nothing. Anyone who has lived close to land knows that waiting can be an active skill. You wait for the soil to dry enough to walk. You wait for water to fall from a path. You wait for an animal to recover strength. You wait for a neighbour who borrowed a tool. You wait for word about a bank or canal. You wait while watching the sky, the insects, the river edge, and the colour of mud. Waiting is how the body learns a season. The emotional tone of this waiting would not have been identical for everyone. A household with full storage might feel more ease than one with less. A person responsible for obligations might calculate differently from a child who sees only the shining water. An official might think in measures and accounts. A farmer might think in soil and labour. A temple administrator might think in offerings and stores. A boatman might think in passage. The same flood made many kinds of thought. Yet in the gentle version of the season we're following there is a shared patience. In the evening, farmers gather near a higher path and look across the water where their fields are resting. They know that under the surface lie ridges, plots, and memories of labour. They also know that the river has work of its own. It is laying down silt, soaking soil, and turning the calendar. When the land returns, they will be ready, or as ready as any people can be when working with water and time. Because the fields and paths have changed, movement also changes. The river becomes more than a boundary. It becomes a road enlarged by the season. Small boats, ferries, skiffs and cargo craft move through a world that is partly familiar and partly remade. To follow the farmers waiting outward, we can step down to the bank, loosen a rope, and let a boat carry us onto the brown gold road. The farmer's relationship to land was not always simple ownership in a modern sense. Land could be connected to temples, the crown, estates, officials, families, and local arrangements that shifted across periods. Some people cultivated land they owed obligations on. Others worked in systems tied to institutions or households of higher status. We do not need to untangle every legal category for this script, but we should remember that a field was both soil and social relationship. When floodwater covered it, obligations did not disappear. Animal labour would become important again when the soil was ready. Oxen or cattle used for ploughing needed care before they were needed in the field. Their strength had to be maintained. Yokes and harnessing arrangements had to function. A farmer looking at a resting animal during Aket might be thinking of Perret already, imagining the line the plough would cut into damp soil. The animal does not know the calendar name, but its body will be part of the coming season. There were also tools of harvest waiting far ahead. Sickles, baskets, carrying poles, threshing areas and storage spaces belong to Shimu, not Aket. Yet a skilled farmer thinks across seasons. A basket repaired now might carry grain months later. A bank checked now might support proper watering later. A rope made now might tie a load at harvest. Agricultural work is not a sequence of isolated tasks. It is a chain where a small repair in the season of water can matter in the season of heat. Flood season could also bring communal work. A bank is rarely useful to only one person. A canal does not serve a single household alone. When shared water structures needed attention, neighbours, officials, labour groups, or estate workers might coordinate efforts. The exact organisation varied, but the principle is clear. Water management is social. It requires agreement, memory, hierarchy, cooperation, and sometimes negotiation. A quiet line of workers repairing a bank can tell us as much about society as a palace inscription. The farmer's waiting contains knowledge of risk, but also knowledge of trust. He cannot command the river to withdraw tomorrow. He cannot plant while the field is still covered. He can prepare tools, care for animals, watch the water, speak with neighbours, and remember what happened before. This is a humble kind of intelligence, not spectacular enough for grand stories, but essential to survival. It is the intelligence of doing what can be done, and leaving the rest to season and time. A farmer might also use Aket to think through seed and storage choices. Which grain should be saved for food, which for sowing, which for obligation, and which for exchange. These decisions were shaped by household need, institutional demands, local custom, and the amount stored from earlier harvests. Seed is a quiet but powerful category. Eat too much of it, and the next season suffers. Guard it well, and the future remains possible. In this way, the coming field begins inside the storage jar. The Nile was one of the great routes of movement in the ancient world. Long before modern roads and engines, the river carried people, animals, grain, stone, timber, messages, pottery, reeds, offerings, and news. During flood season, when water spread into low fields and changed ordinary paths, boats could become even more central to daily movement. Not every journey was grand. Many were small, crossing to a neighbour, carrying a bundle, ferrying a person, bringing reeds, moving jars, or checking a place now easier to reach by water. Imagine a small boat at dusk. It may be made of papyrus bundles in some contexts, or of wood in others. Egypt used many types of craft for different purposes. A boatman pushes away from the bank with a pole. The rope slips wetly through his hand. The hull or bundled reeds shift under weight. A child sits low, told to keep still. A basket rests beside a sealed jar. A rolled mat lies near the stern. The water is calm enough that every movement seems deliberate. The current flows northward, toward the delta and the sea. The wind, often from the north, could help sailing vessels move southward against the current. This gave the Nile a practical balance: drift, row, or be carried north, raise a sail and work south when conditions allowed. Of course, real travel depended on season, boat type, cargo, wind, skill, and local water, but the river's combination of current and wind made it a natural corridor of communication across a long, narrow land. For small village movement, the boat is less a symbol than a tool. It takes a person where feet cannot go during Akhet. It carries fish traps, reed bundles, grain jars, letters, clay ceilings, and household goods. It brings someone to a temple landing or storehouse. It moves an animal if needed, though that is more difficult. It lets a farmer inspect a bank from the waterside. It lets a child see the top of a submerged path as a wavering line below the surface. The sound of a boat in flood season is gentle. Water pats the side. A pole enters mud with a soft push. Rope fibres creak. A wooden plank complains quietly under a shifting foot. Voices lower as evening comes on. From the water, the village looks different. Houses rise from higher ground. Palm trunks stand in reflections. A cooking fire appears as a small orange mark in a doorway. The desert beyond becomes violet in the fading light. Larger boats bring another world into view. Along the Nile, cargo craft and barges could carry heavy loads, including grain, stone, timber, and goods, connected to estates, temples, or royal projects. We do not need to turn this sleep script toward monumental construction, but it is worth remembering that the same river carrying a villager's basket could also carry administrative power, temple wealth, and state resources. The Nile joined the small and the large in one moving surface. A scribe travelling by boat has his own concerns. Documents must stay dry. A pallet must be kept safe. A message tied and sealed must arrive with its meaning intact. He may sit under a bit of shade, holding a packet away from spray, while the boatman watches the current. A sealed jar or basket may be part of a delivery to a storehouse. The journey is not romantic to them. It is work. But from our distance, the scene has a quiet grace. Paper, water, rope, clay, and human trust. Boats also carried religious life. Images, offerings, and ritual movements could involve river travel, especially in temple contexts and festivals, though specific practices varied widely across regions and periods. The river made sacred geography navigable. A processional boat was not the same as a ferry, and a temple bark was not the same as a farmer's skiff, but water connected them in the imagination. To travel on the Nile was to move through a landscape where practical and sacred meanings often overlapped. As night approaches, the small boat returns. The boatman knows the bank by memory, but flood season has changed the landing. He chooses a firm place. Someone reaches for the rope. The jar is lifted first, then the basket, then the sleepy child. Water closes softly behind the pole. The boat rests again, Tide higher than it was the week before, tomorrow it may carry reeds. The next day it may carry a message. The river road remains open beneath the stars. From the bank, one delivery moves toward a shaded room where goods are counted. The flood has changed the fields, but it has not removed calculation from the year. Grain, jars, labour, offerings, rations, and records still matter. So we follow the quiet cargo inland, away from the boat, toward storehouses and scribes, where the season is translated into numbers, seals, and patient marks of ink. Boat construction in ancient Egypt ranged from small reed craft to sophisticated wooden vessels. Some boats were built from local materials, while larger wooden boats required timber that might be scarce or imported, especially high-quality cedar and other woods used in elite or specialized contexts. The famous preserved boats associated with royal burials show extraordinary skill, but everyday watercraft are often humbler. Still, even a small boat represents knowledge. How to make something float, carry weight, turn, land, and survive repeated use. Landings were important social places. A landing might be only a firm bank with a post or a shaped edge, or it might be associated with a larger settlement, temple, estate, or administrative point. During Akhet, when water levels changed, the best place to land could shift. People knew which bank was safe, which mud was too soft, where a boat could be tied overnight, and where cargo could be lifted without slipping. A landing is a threshold between river time and village time. Navigation was practical and sensory. A boatman watched the current, wind, floating debris, submerged obstacles, bank shapes, and the behaviour of water around reeds or stones. He knew when to pole, when to row, when to let the current help, when to keep away from a softened edge, and when to wait. Such knowledge is rarely celebrated in formal histories, yet it would have been indispensable. A river civilization depends not only on rulers and scribes, but on people who can read moving water. The cargo of a flood-season boat could be ordinary enough to be beautiful: a basket of fish, a bundle of reeds, a jar sealed with clay, a sack of grain from storage, a coil of rope, a folded cloth, a clay lamp, a message tied carefully, a tired passenger, a sleeping child. These are not random objects. Each belongs to a chain of use. The boat gathers the household, the field, the marsh, the storehouse, and the administrative world into one small floating space. At night, boats become part of the soundscape. A hull taps a post, a rope tightens and loosens with the water. Someone crossing late speaks in a low voice. A lamp flickers near a landing, reflected in moving lines. The river road does not close completely with darkness, but movement becomes slower and more careful. For a listener drifting towards sleep, this is a fitting image. The boat tied secure, the cargo unloaded, the water still moving though the village rests. The river also carried language, accents, names, instructions, greetings, complaints, jokes, prayers, and news moved from landing to landing. A boat arriving at dusk might bring word of a relative, a temple festival, a delivery, a damaged bank, or the water's behaviour upstream. Ancient Egypt was connected by writing, but also by spoken messages that vanished as soon as they were delivered. The river's road was therefore a road of voices, most of them unrecorded but necessary. Some journeys were short enough to be measured in minutes, while others followed the river for days. A traveller on a longer trip would see the valley change gradually. One village's palm grove, another's landing, a stretch of cliff, a temple wall, a line of cattle, a field basin filled to the sky. The river offered continuity but never sameness. Every bend had its own bank, its own people, its own small arrangements with the flood. A storehouse is not as famous as a pyramid or temple wall, but it may bring us closer to how a society functioned day by day. Grain was central to ancient Egyptian life. Food, wages or rations in many contexts, tax obligations, offerings, wealth and security. To store grain was to hold part of the year in reserve. To count it was to make memory official. During flood season, when fields were covered and future harvests still uncertain, stored food and careful records would have carried special importance. Imagine a shaded storage area near a village, estate, or temple complex. The exact architecture could vary, but the feeling is clear enough. Baskets and jars stand in rows. Grain dust hangs in the air where light enters through a doorway. A clay ceiling lies near a container. A scribe sits with a palette, reed pen and writing surface. Someone speaks a number aloud. Someone else shifts a basket into place. The mood is not hurried, but it is attentive. Mistakes matter in the world of stores. Scribes connected the spoken, material and administrative worlds. They listened, calculated, recorded and preserved information. Some worked for temples, some for royal or local administration, some for estates or institutions whose organisation changed through time. Their work could include land records, labour organisation, deliveries, accounts, taxation, rations and offerings. In relation to the flood, expected agricultural output, field condition and stored grain could all become matters of record, though the details were not the same in every period. The act of writing is quiet enough for a sleep script. The scribe dips the reed. He pauses while a measure is checked. He makes a line of signs. The ink darkens on the surface. A correction may be spoken. A container may be sealed. A small lump of clay receives the pressure of a seal, carrying identity and control in one simple mark. The storehouse is full of textures. Rough basketry, smooth pottery, dusty grain, dry reed, damp clay, worn wood, and the faint oiliness of human hands. Grain measures were not just numbers. They represented work already done. Ploughing, sowing, watching, weeding, harvesting, threshing, winnowing, carrying, drying, storing. Every basket in the storehouse contains a memory of fields under another season's sky. During Akhet, when the new fields are underwater, old grain stands between households and the future. This does not need to be told dramatically. It is enough to understand that storage is a form of calm seriousness. The storehouse also reminds us that ancient Egyptian society was organized through relationships of obligation and distribution. Temples and palaces could hold large resources. Estates could manage agricultural production. Local communities could participate in systems of assessment and labor. Ordinary people might receive grain, owe grain, store grain, or deliver grain depending on status and circumstance. We should avoid imagining a modern bureaucracy, but we should also avoid seeing the village as isolated. The river valley was connected by records as well as water. In the flood season, a scribe may consult older records. He might compare a measure, check a delivery, or note information about water and land. Some records known from ancient Egypt are administrative, practical and precise. Others survive by chance and from particular contexts. What we have is uneven. Yet the pattern is clear enough to show that writing helped make agriculture legible to institutions. The flood that shimmered beautifully outside also became entries, amounts, expectations, and stored obligations. There is something slightly lonely about the storehouse at the end of the day. Work has slowed, dust settles, the baskets no longer move. The scribe cleans his pen, closes or protects his materials, and places the record where it belongs. A guard, servant or worker checks the door. Outside, the flooded land reflects evening light. Inside, the grain lies dry. Two kinds of time meet here, the river's flowing time and the counted time of human record. Yet even this counting world is not separate from faith, ritual and meaning. Grain could be part of offerings. Temples were economic institutions as well as sacred places. The abundance associated with the flood entered prayer, image and ceremony. A jar counted in a storehouse might later become bread for workers, provisions for a household, or an offering laid before a god. The line between practical and sacred was not always drawn where a modern listener might expect. So as the record is put away, and the storehouse grows still, we can follow the scent of incense, the coolness of stone, and the murmur of ritual language toward the temple. There, the flood is not only measured or stored, it is thanked, imagined, personified, and woven into the sacred order of the world. The measures used for grain and other goods change through Egyptian history, and we do not need to burden the listener with the table of units. What matters for our calm journey is that measurement was embodied. Grain was poured, levelled, counted, moved, sealed, and stored. A measure was not only an abstract number, it was a container held by hands, a basket carried by shoulders, a pile watched by eyes, and a record made by ink. Administration began in the material world. Ceilings are especially evocative. A lump of clay pressed over a cord, jar stopper, door fastening, or container closure could bear the impression of a seal. When intact, it showed that the contents had not been opened without authority. When broken, it marked access. Such small clay pieces survive in archaeological context and help scholars understand control, ownership, delivery and administration. In a storehouse scene, the seal is quiet but powerful, a thumb of clay holding trust, authority and memory. Ostraca, the broken pieces of pottery or flakes of limestone used for writing, offer another glimpse into everyday record-keeping and learning. Many famous ostraca come from specific communities and periods, so we should not spread them carelessly across all Egypt. But the broader idea of writing on convenient surfaces helps us imagine administration as practical rather than grand. Not every note required a fine papyrus roll. Sometimes a broken sherd was enough for a list, draft, instruction or account. Storehouses could be connected to temples and estates, and those institutions could redistribute grain as rations or payments. Workers on projects, temple staff, dependents and labour groups might receive measured goods. This means that stored grain travelled through society in organised ways. The flood outside nourished fields, but the storehouse nourished labour systems and households. Between them stood the scribe, the measurer, the carrier, the seal, and the jar. There is also an ethics of careful counting, at least in the ideal imagination of Egyptian administration. Good order required correct measures, honest records and proper distribution, even if real people could fall short. Tomb autobiographies and wisdom texts sometimes present ideals of fairness, truth and responsibility. We do not need to quote them. It is enough to sense that numbers were not only technical, they belong to a moral world in which balance, accuracy and obligation mattered. Learning to be a scribe required training, discipline and access. Students practiced signs, copied model texts, learned calculations, and absorbed the habits of administration. This education could separate scribes from many manual labourers, yet their work still depended on the physical world those labourers maintained. A record of grain means little without farmers, carriers, potters, rope makers, boatmen, and storehouse workers. The scribe's ink sits at the end of many other people's effort. The storehouse also contained silence of a particular kind. It was not the open silence of the desert or the watery silence of the flooded fields. It was enclosed, dusty, and expectant. Containers waited to be opened, records waited to be consulted, grain waited to become bread, beer, rations, offerings, or seed. A storehouse is a pause between seasons, a room where past harvest and future need sit together in the dark. In ancient Egyptian thought, the Nile inundation could be associated with Hapi, a divine personification of the flood, abundance, and fertility. Hapi was not the river in a simple modern sense. An Egyptian religion changed across centuries and places, but the association between the annual inundation and divine generosity was powerful. When water rose in the right measure, it could be understood not only as a natural event, but as a sign of renewal within a sacred order. Let us enter a temple gently, without pretending we know every rite in every village. Temples varied enormously in scale and function. Some were major institutions with lands, workshops, priests, storehouses, and administrative roles. Others were smaller sacred places woven into local life. The temple was not merely a quiet chapel in the modern sense. It could be a house of the god, an economic centre, a place of ritual purity, a store of offerings, an employer, a symbol of order, and a point of connection between the community and the divine. The evening light falls warm on a temple wall. Stone holds the day's heat. Incense rises in a thin, slow line. A priest carries water in a vessel. Another person prepares offerings of bread, beer, flowers, or produce, depending on place, occasion, and means. The details of ritual should be handled carefully, because surviving temple inscriptions and scenes often come from formal elite contexts. Still, water, offerings, purity, and abundance are safe themes to hold gently. They belong to the broad atmosphere of Egyptian religious life. Hapi might be shown in art with symbols of fertility and abundance, sometimes carrying offerings, plants, or signs of nourishment. The flood brought silt, fish, reeds, and moisture. It made grain possible. It linked the far south with the north. In this sense, the inundation was not only useful, it was meaningful. To praise the flood was to praise the condition that allowed houses, temples, animals, fields, and storehouses to continue. We can imagine an original, quiet, hymn-like moment, not copied from any ancient text, but inspired by the mood of gratitude. Water that comes in season, soil that darkens, reeds that bend, fish that turn below the surface, bread that will one day rise from grain not yet planted, shade beside a wall, jars that do not stand empty, boats that return at dusk. Such words do not need to be shouted. In a sleep narration, they can be almost a whisper, a way of feeling how practical abundance and sacred thanks could meet. Temples also connected flood season to cosmic order. The Egyptian concept, often translated as Met, included ideas of truth, balance, order, justice, and right arrangement, though no single English word captures it perfectly. The reliable turning of seasons could be seen within that larger order. When the flood came as hoped, when offerings were made, when records were kept, when fields later emerged, the world felt aligned. This does not mean life was easy or equal. It means that order mattered deeply in Egyptian imagination. A villager might experience the temple differently from a priest or official. Some sacred spaces were restricted. Ordinary people may have approached outer areas, participated in festivals, brought offerings, heard processions, or lived within the temple's economic reach. We should not flatten these relationships. But even from outside a wall, the temple could shape the soundscape of Akhet. A chant carried on air, a bell or sistrum in some contexts, footsteps on stone, the smell of incense drifting into evening. Water itself could be ritually important. Priests needed purity. Sacred lakes existed at some temple sites. Libations were poured. Vessels carried liquid as offering and cleansing. Again, details vary, but the symbolism is gentle and clear. The flood outside the walls and the water held in a vessel are not the same in scale, yet both speak of renewal. One covers fields, the other moves through ritual hands. One is vast, the other is carefully offered. As night gathers, the temple quiets. The last light leaves the carved edges of stone. The air cools. A worker passes with an empty basket. A priest steps away from an inner space. Someone secures a vessel. The river beyond the village reflects the same darkening sky. Sacred gratitude does not erase practical concern, and practical labour does not erase sacred meaning. In ancient Egypt, these could sit close together, like a storehouse near a temple wall or a field boundary near a shrine. The temple sounds fade into open air. Beyond the houses and higher paths, the flood water reaches into marshy edges where reeds grow thick, birds settle, fish move, and the Nile becomes a living world of small sounds. From stone and incense we drift outward again, into papyrus shade and the soft trembling of water plants. In some Egyptian images, abundance is shown through offering bearers, laden tables, plants, animals, and flowing forms. Such images do not simply illustrate food, they express a world made orderly through provision. Happy, associated with inundation, could appear as a bringer of abundance, sometimes in paired forms representing different regions or aspects of the land. The iconography is complex, and we need not analyze every symbol. For tonight, we can hold the simplest feeling. Water rises, land is renewed, offerings become possible. Temple ritual often happened in spaces ordinary people could not fully enter. The innermost rooms were for trained priests and sacred images. But festivals, processions, outer courts, temple economies, and sound could connect wider communities to sacred life. A person might not see the deepest ritual and still know that the temple marked the season. Incense drifting over a wall, a procession glimpsed from a distance, or a delivery of offerings could make sacred order present in everyday space. The Nile's sacred meaning also connected to the broader Egyptian sense that life emerged from water. Creation traditions varied, but primeval waters and the emergence of order are important themes in Egyptian thought. We should avoid turning this section into dense mythology, yet the resonance is gentle. Each year, water covers the land, and then land emerges again. The agricultural cycle echoes a deeper symbolic pattern. Mud appears from water. Green life rises from mud. Order returns from seeming formlessness. Priests themselves were workers within institutions. They purified, recited, carried, recorded, cleaned, prepared, received, and maintained. Some priestly roles were part-time or rotating in certain contexts, and temples employed many kinds of personnel. To imagine the temple only as silent holiness would be incomplete. It had storerooms, courtyards, workshops, kitchens, boats, animals, and accounts. During flood season, sacred gratitude and practical management could share the same enclosure. A quiet offering scene might include bread, beer, flowers, incense, water, and perhaps early produce from another season's stores. The offering is not a feast in our telling, but a carefully arranged act. A vessel is placed, a loaf is set down, a flame is watched. The words spoken may be formal, but the atmosphere remains soft. Outside, the floodwater reflects the sky. Inside, human beings respond with order, gesture, and gratitude. Sacred images of abundance often joined north and south, field and marsh, plant and water, human labour and divine provision. The flood could therefore be imagined as unifying the land, even while actual communities experienced it locally. A person standing in a small village might never see the whole Nile Valley, but ritual language and temple imagery could make the river feel larger than any one bank. It tied the place under one's feet to a sacred geography stretching far beyond sight. The temple calendar may not have matched household feeling exactly. Priests followed ritual schedules, festivals, offerings, purifications, and duties that could continue regardless of whether one farmer's path was underwater. Yet the flood drew these worlds closer. The same water that changed a village lane also filled sacred language with meaning. The same grain counted in a storehouse might one day appear as offering bread, the sacred and ordinary touch through repeated acts. The marshes of the Nile were places of beauty, work, food, material and symbol. In ancient Egyptian tomb art, marsh scenes appear often. Papyrus thickets, boats, birds, fish, lotus flowers, hunting, fowling, and family groups in idealized landscapes. These images are valuable, but they are not photographs of every person's daily life. They show elite ideals, religious meanings, and artistic conventions. Still, they remind us that the marsh edge mattered. It was not empty water. It was a rich, rustling world. During flood season, the boundaries between river, field, and marsh could shift. Reeds stood in water. Papyrus thickets rose where channels widened. Birds moved through shallows and settled among stems. Fish passed below the surface. Frogs called at night. Insects hovered in the warm air. Lotus imagery, whether in actual water plants or artistic symbolism, brought associations of beauty, fragrance, rebirth, and light. To move through this space was to enter another version of the Nile, less orderly than fields and more woven with wildlife. Imagine a reed boat nosing through still water. The person in it does not speak much. The pole enters between stems. Water opens, then closes. A bird lifts suddenly, wings beating once, twice, then settles farther away. The air smells of wet plants, mud, and sun-warmed water. A dragonfly pauses above the surface. Underneath, fish shift like shadows. The village sounds are muted here, replaced by rustle, splash, and the quiet scraping of reeds along the boat. The marsh provided resources. Fish could be caught in nets, traps, or with lines and spears depending on context. Birds and eggs could be collected in some settings. Reeds and papyrus could be cut and bundled. Plant fibres became mats, baskets, ropes, sandals, boat parts, and many other useful items. Papyrus also became writing material in particular processes and contexts, though not every bundle of marsh plant was destined for a scribe. The plant world of the Nile entered practical life in countless forms. Cutting reeds is slow work. A person chooses stems of useful height and thickness. A blade moves low. The cut stems are gathered, aligned, and bound with cord. The bundle is awkward but familiar. When carried back to the village, it may become a mat, a screen, a repair material, roofing, basketry, fuel, or fodder depending on the plant and need. The marsh, then, is not separate from the household. Its rustling stems return as objects under people's hands. Fishing also ties the marsh to the table. Fish were important in ancient Egyptian diet, though preferences, taboos, preservation methods, and social attitudes varied by time, place, and species. Some fish could be eaten fresh. Others might be dried or salted. For a flood season household, a successful catch brings variety and nourishment. A net lifted from water glitters briefly. Fish turn silver-brown in the light. A child watches from the bank. A basket is lined, filled, and carried home before evening. The marsh is also an imaginative space. In art and literature, watery places could carry ideas of fertility, pleasure, renewal, danger, and the edge between order and wildness. For ordinary people, it may have been both useful and unpredictable, a place to gather, fish, cut, travel, and watch one's footing. We do not need to over-define it. Sleep comes more easily when a place is allowed to remain partly mysterious, as marshes often do. They show what is near and hide what is beneath. The light changes across the reeds. Morning makes them pale and silver. Midday turns them sharp and green gold. Evening softens them into dark vertical lines against the water. Birds come and go. Some call once and fall silent. Others stir hidden in the thicket. The sound is never entirely still, yet it is restful because it has no hurry. Water touches stems. Stems touch one another. The boat drifts. The person cutting reeds pauses to drink and look back toward the village roofs. In this interlude of natural history, we should remember again that access to marsh resources could be shaped by land rights, local custom, elite control, temple or estate ownership, and practical distance. The Nile world was not a simple open commons for everyone at all times, yet the materials of marsh and river appear so widely in Egyptian life that the connection is unmistakable. Reeds became shelter, storage, transport, writing, and rest. Birds and fish became food and symbol. Water plants entered both daily labour and sacred art. By late afternoon, the reed bundle returns to the village. It is wet at the cut ends. A few insects rise from it. Someone sets it against a wall to dry. The marsh sounds fade behind the household noises. A jar set down, a goat shifting, a child calling softly, a tool scraping. The flood season has brought water into the fields, but it has also brought materials to hand. From the reeds and fish and birds, we return to the small work of waiting, where the season is shaped into useful things. Papyrus deserves a little more attention, because it touched Egypt in both practical and symbolic ways. Its tall stems could form thickets that sheltered birds and framed watery scenes. Its pith could be processed into writing sheets in particular craft traditions. Bundles could help make light boats. Stems and fibres could enter mats, baskets, and other objects. In art, papyrus could symbolize Lower Egypt, freshness, and marsh abundance. One plant could belong to a scribe's hand, a boatman's craft, a bird's nest, and a temple image. Fish processing was another practical art. Fresh fish does not last long in heat, so drying, salting, or other preservation methods mattered. Scenes and archaeological evidence suggest that fish played a role in diet and economy, though there were variations in taste, status, and religious restrictions concerning certain species in certain places. For our calm scene, it is enough to picture a catch sorted in shade, some fish cooked soon, Others prepared for later, the smell sharp but ordinary near the water's edge. Bird life made the marsh visually and audibly rich. Ducks, geese, ibises, herons, and other water birds appear in Egyptian art and would have inhabited Nile environments in different ways. Some were hunted, some observed, some sacred in particular associations, and some simply part of the living landscape. A bird lifting from reeds at dawn is a small event, but it can hold the whole mood of the marsh. Sudden movement, then quiet again. Lotus and water lily imagery brings another layer of softness. Egyptian art often used water flowers in scenes of pleasure, rebirth, fragrance, and offering. Real plants open and close with light in ways that naturally invite symbolism. We do not need to insist that every villager saw them through formal theology. A person may simply have noticed beauty, a pale flower on dark water, a scent in warm air, a child reaching toward a bloom and being told not to lean too far. The marsh can be calming, but it is not a fantasy garden. Mud can trap a foot, insects bite, water hides depth, reeds cut skin, boats can snag. People who used marsh resources needed skill and caution. Mentioning this gently makes the scene more real without making it frightening. The person cutting reeds knows where to step, how to balance the bundle when the light is fading and when it is time to return home before the water world becomes too difficult to read. Gardens and ponds near houses or elite residences echoed the marsh in more controlled form. Trees, flowers, pools and birds appear in Egyptian art as images of pleasure, shade, and renewal. Most ordinary villagers would not live inside the ideal garden scenes painted in tombs, but the love of cool water, shade and greenery is easy to understand. After the brightness of desert and field, a place of leaves and water could feel like rest made visible. A marsh at sunset can feel like the world speaking softly in many small voices. One reed clicks against another. A fish breaks the surface and is gone. Wings stir behind a screen of stems. Mud releases a faint smell as the air cools. For people who worked there, these sounds were not simply peaceful, they were information. They told of movement, weather, creatures, water depth, and the hour of return. The season of waiting is filled with small work. This is one of the most important truths for making the past feel real. A field underwater may seem still, but the village is full of hands preparing for what comes next. Baskets are repaired, mats are woven, rope is twisted, nets are checked, clay is shaped, walls are patched, boat seams are examined, tools are mended, storage spaces are cleaned. These tasks may not appear in grand historical summaries, but without them the farming year would come apart. Reeds gathered from the marsh become useful under patient hands. A mat begins as a set of stems laid in order. One strand crosses another. The pattern tightens. A rough edge is trimmed. The finished mat may lie on a floor, cover a jar, shade a doorway, help dry grain, or become part of another household arrangement. Basketry has similar quiet intelligence. A basket must be strong enough to carry, flexible enough not to split, and shaped for the work expected of it. Rope making is another humble skill. Plant fibres, flax, palm fibre, leather strips, or other materials could be twisted, plaited, or tied depending on purpose and region. Rope holds boats, animals, bundles, tools, roofing, and loads. A bad rope can fail at the wrong moment. A good rope disappears into usefulness. In our village, a person sits in a doorway twisting fibres against the thigh, testing tension with practiced fingers. The action is repetitive, but not empty. Each turn stores future strength. Clay belongs everywhere. The Nile's mud contributed to brick-making, pottery, plaster, patches, and countless small repairs. Mud brick houses needed maintenance over time, though we should not imagine that every flood destroyed walls. People built on higher ground and understood local conditions. Still, damp, weathering, use, and age all required attention. A wall may be patched, a floor may be smoothed, a storage bin may be repaired. Clay is lifted, pressed, shaped, and left to dry. Pottery making could occur at household, village, or specialised workshop levels depending on period and need. A simple vessel begins with clay prepared and formed. It may be shaped by hand with tools, or on a wheel in later contexts, then dried and fired. Not every household made all its own pottery, and production varied. But the presence of pottery in daily life was constant. A jar cracked at the rim may be reused for another purpose. A broken sherd may later serve as a label, scoop, tool, or writing surface. Boat maintenance brings the river into craft work. A small boat must be checked where seams loosen, pegs shift, lashings wear, or reeds weaken. Wood was valuable in Egypt, especially good timber, and boats represented skill and resources. Papyrus craft had different needs from wooden boats, and larger vessels required more specialised knowledge. The boatman or carpenter does not think in abstractions. He presses a hand against a seam, feels for movement, listens to a creak, and decides what must be fixed before the next crossing. Metal tools, where used, also required care. Copper, bronze, and later iron in much later periods belong to complex histories of technology and trade. For a broad pharaonic setting, it is safest to speak generally of copper or bronze tools in some contexts, alongside stone, wood, bone, and flint elements. A blade is sharpened, a wooden handle is replaced, a small awl is kept safe. Materials are too valuable to waste casually. Repair is part of the economy of survival. The season's craftwork also shows that ancient villages were not made only of farmers. Some people specialised more than others. Potters, carpenters, weavers, boatmen, herders, scribes, and labourers might live near one another or work through temples, estates, and local networks. Some tasks were done in households. Others required skilled specialists. Flood season could bring different people into conversation. The farmer needing a repair, the boatman needing rope, the weaver needing fibre, the scribe needing a surface, the household needing storage. There is a soothing quality to this part of Akhet because it is all preparation without haste. Everyone knows the fields will return, but not today. The water still lies over the low ground. The river has not finished its work, so the village continues with tasks that fit the day. A basket rim is tightened, a mat is rolled, a jar is set aside, a tool is hung on a wall, a boat is tied carefully, a net is spread to dry where the sun can reach it. As days pass, the accumulation of small work begins to feel like readiness. No single repair changes the year, but together they prepare the household for Perret. The fields are hidden, yet seed baskets are thought of. The animals are cared for, the tools are waiting, the canals and banks are watched. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the water begins to change. A mark that was covered is visible again. A bank shows at dawn. Damp earth appears like a memory returning. Flax work connects field, household, and cloth. Flax grown in the agricultural cycle could become linen through a series of processes. Pulling, drying, retting in some methods, separating fibres, spinning, weaving, and finishing. The exact techniques varied, and not every household performed every step. But linen's presence in ancient Egypt was so broad that it deserves to be felt as part of the season's material world. A thread pulled smooth through fingers is a quiet line connecting soil to garment. Brick making, when conditions allowed, was another earthbound craft. Mud, straw, water, wooden moulds, and sun could turn riverine materials into building blocks. Flood season itself may not always be the ideal moment for all stages of brick production, depending on moisture and drying conditions, but repairs and planning certainly belong to the household year. A mud brick wall is a stored season. River silt, chopped straw, sunlight, labour, and time hardened into shelter. Firing pottery required fuel and skill. A simple vessel shaped by hand still had to survive drying and firing without cracking badly. The potter understood clay texture, wall thickness, air pockets, temperature, and patience. Some pottery was mass-produced in workshops. Other items might be local and humble. When you see a jar in a storehouse or household, you're also seeing the potter's knowledge, even if the potter's name is gone. The sounds of craft are different from field work. There is the scrape of a blade on wood, the tap of a peg, the soft thud of clay, the whisper of fibre pulled through fingers, the creak of a basket rim under pressure, the murmur of people working side by side. These sounds suit Aket because they are close, shaded, and repetitive. They give the flooded season an interior music, while outside the water continues to hold the fields in silence. Small work also gives people a sense of usefulness when the larger work must wait. Waiting can make time feel wide. Craft narrows it to a hand's movement, a pattern, a repair, a finished object. A person who cannot plant today can still mend the basket that will carry seed. A person who cannot cross the lower path can still weave the mat that will shade a doorway. In this way, the village answers the flood not with impatience, but with preparation. Some repairs were probably accompanied by teaching. A skilled hand slows down so a younger person can watch. A knot is shown twice. A reed is bent and then straightened. A cracked rim is pointed out. A tool is handed over for practice. Much ancient knowledge moved this way, not through written manuals but through bodies beside bodies, eyes following hands. Flood season, with its slower domestic and craft work, would have offered many such moments of quiet instruction. There is economy in repair. A cracked jar might be reused for dry goods, a broken basket trimmed into a smaller one, a worn cloth cut into strips, a piece of wood reshaped for another purpose. In a world where many materials required significant labour to obtain or make, waste carried a cost. The flood season's quiet repairs reveal a practical creativity that rarely appears in royal history but must have filled ordinary life. The end of Aket is not a door closing. It is a slow exhale. The water that covered the low fields begins to withdraw, leaving behind damp soil, silt, and a changed surface. At first, only the highest ridges appear. A line of mud breaks the reflection of the sky. Then a path returns in pieces. A field corner emerges. The base of a tree is visible again. Children notice it first, perhaps, because children notice changes close to the ground. Adults notice too, but with calculation. The exposed mud shines in morning light. It holds the smell of wet earth, plant matter and river. A farmer steps carefully onto a returning ridge and feels his foot sink slightly. He knows this soil. It is familiar and not familiar. Water has moved over it, softened it, renewed it, and perhaps altered its edges. The land must be read again. Where is the old boundary? Where has silt gathered? Where has a bank softened? Where can animals pass? Where should tools wait? After inundation, the season of Paris begins, the time of emergence and growing. As the land dries enough for work, farmers prepare for planting in moist, fertile soil. Crops in ancient Egypt included emmer wheat and barley, both central grains, as well as flax, legumes, onions, garlic, lettuce, and other plants depending on period and region. We do not need a long crop list. It is better to picture a seed basket, a field edge, a wooden tool, and the first thought of green. Field boundaries mattered. The flood could obscure ridges, soften markers, or leave silt in ways that required recognition and in some cases surveying or local agreement. Ancient Egypt is famous for measurement, and later Greek writers associated Egyptian geometry with the need to remeasure land after floods, though such claims should be treated carefully. Still, it is reasonable to say that land knowledge, boundaries, records, and practical surveying could matter after the waters withdrew. Fields had owners, obligations, and histories. A scribe or local official may appear in this part of the season not as a dramatic authority, but as one piece of a working landscape. A boundary is discussed, a measure is checked, an elder remembers where a ridge used to run, a farmer points toward a tree, a bank, a canal edge, a stone, or another remembered marker. The scene stays calm. People are not arguing in our telling. They are restoring the map of the land after the river has blurred it. Canals, ditches, and banks are checked. Some need repair. Some are opened or cleared. Water management does not end when the flood withdraws. It changes form. Moisture must be used wisely. Fields must be planted at the right time. Animals may be brought closer as footing improves. Tools come out of storage. A plough is lifted down. A basket is filled. A rope that was made during Akhet now has a job. The small work of waiting becomes the larger work of return. We should be cautious with the shadouf, the counterweighted water-lifting device often associated with ancient Egypt. It is more securely attested from the New Kingdom onward, and not every period or place should be imagined with one. If our broad scene includes later pharaonic life, such a device might appear near a field or garden, helping lift water from a channel. But because our episode stays broadly timeless, we need not rely on it. The main image is simpler: moist soil, prepared seed, people watching the land emerge. The first planting preparations carry a feeling different from the quiet of floodwater. There is more movement now. Voices call across fields. Animals are led along returning paths. Baskets are carried. Children follow behind adults, stepping where they're told. A person bends to take a handful of dark soil, presses it, and lets it fall. The soil is not merely dirt. It is the season's promise made tangible. Under the hand, the river has become land again. Evening after the first preparations feels full but peaceful. The fields are not yet green. The harvest is far away. Many uncertainties remain, as they always do in farming. But the cycle has turned. The water has done its work and is moved back into channels and the river's body. The village is less island-like now. Paths begin to reconnect. The familiar world reappears, not exactly as before, but close enough for memory to settle into it again. From the roof, the view has changed once more. Where there was a shallow sea, there are now dark strips of earth. Where reflections covered boundaries, ridges catch low light. The desert beyond looks the same, but the cultivated land has been renewed. Akhet is ending, Paris is beginning, and the people of the village turn toward the next labour of the year. As night comes down, the river keeps moving, quieter now, carrying the season onward. The first days after water recedes are full of judgment. Soil that looks ready may still be too soft. A path that appears solid may give way under a hoof. A bank that survived from a distance may have weakened at its base. Farmers and local workers do not rush blindly onto the land. They test, watch, and compare. The return of fields is exciting, but it requires restraint. A good beginning to Paris depends on reading moisture correctly. Planting in the moist soil after inundation allowed crops to use the stored water without constant rainfall. Egypt's agricultural advantage lay partly in this seasonal gift, though irrigation work and later water lifting methods also mattered. Seeds could be broadcast or placed depending on crop and practice. Animals might be used to trample seed into softened ground in some depictions and contexts, though scenes should be interpreted with care. The main point is that soil, seed, animal and human timing came together. Flax, barley and emmer each carried different future uses. Grain would become bread, beer, rations, offerings, and stored wealth. Flax would become linen, cord, and other textile products. Vegetables and legumes would help feed households. A field was therefore not only a food source, but a source of fabric, rope, trade, temple offerings, and administrative value. When the first seed basket is lifted, it contains more than next season's plants. It contains the village's connection to many kinds of work. Surveying and boundary recognition could be quiet community acts. People may rely on markers, records, memory, local authority, or practical agreement. A ridge is rebuilt. A line is walked. A canal edge is cleared. No one needs to speak loudly. The land itself encourages measured movement. After weeks of reflection and water, the field is becoming a map again, and maps are social. They tell people not only where soil lies, but how responsibilities lie across it. By the time the first stars appear over the newly exposed ground, the village has crossed an invisible threshold. Akhet is not entirely gone, because water remains in channels and dampness remains in earth, but the mind has turned toward Paris. The people sleep with tomorrow's work nearer than it was before. The tools by the wall are no longer only waiting, they're almost ready to be lifted. The first green shoots after planting would not appear immediately in our closing scene, but they are already present in the mind. Farmers often live ahead of visible change. They see a bare field and imagine growth. They see seed and imagine grain. They see mud and imagine bread. This ability to look at what is not yet there is part of agriculture's emotional life. Paris begins not only when plants rise, but when people trust the dark soil enough to begin again. Birds follow the changing ground as well. Where water becomes shallow, they search for food. Where mud appears, tracks mark the surface before human feet do. The returning field is briefly shared by birds, insects, animals, and people, each reading it differently. A farmer may see future barley. A bird sees a feeding place. A child sees a new place to step. The land's emergence is not only agricultural, it is ecological and sensory. We have followed the Nile through one calm flood season, not as a perfect account of every ancient Egyptian life, but as a gentle reconstruction built from known rhythms, material clues, and careful imagination. We began before dawn, when the river was still dark and the fields waited under starlight. We watched the land reveal its shape, the green ribbon beside the river, the desert edge beyond it, the village on higher ground, and the low fields ready to receive the water. We listened to the year as ancient Egyptians often understood it through Akhet, Paris, and Shemu, inundation, emergence, and harvest. We stood by measuring marks where the river's rise could be read. We imagine scribes making records, farmers comparing memory with the present, and households adjusting to the slow arrival of water. We saw the fields become a shallow sea, not as a disaster, but as part of a cycle of renewal, moisture, silt, and waiting. We entered the village, where mud brick houses held the human world above the floodplain. Bread was made, grain was ground, linen was mended, jars were checked. Children watched the water from roofs and doorways. Elders remembered other years. Animals shifted in pens. Lamps waited for evening. The flood changed the map outside, but inside the household, life continued through small, steady acts. We sat with farmers during the season when fields were hidden, and we saw that waiting could be work. Tools were repaired, animals were tended, ropes were twisted, banks and channels were watched. People prepared for a future field they could not yet walk. We drifted on boats along the brown gold road, remembering that the Nile carried not only water, but people, goods, messages, offerings, and news. We stepped into storehouses where grain stood dry while the fields lay wet. There, scribes counted and recorded, placing the season into measures as marks. We entered temple shade, where the inundation could be understood through gratitude, order, offering, and the divine figure of happy. We moved into the marsh, where reeds whispered, birds lifted, fish turned below the surface, and the materials of daily life grew from the water itself. Then we returned to the village's small work: baskets, mats, clay, tools, boats, nets, and storage. We watched preparation gather quietly while the water finished its work. Finally the flood withdrew. Mud appeared, boundaries returned, seed baskets were readied. The land emerged dark and shining, carrying the promise of Paris, the growing season. The river had covered the fields, and then it gave them back. It is worth ending with balance. The Nile inundation was not always easy, not always ideal, and not identical every year. Ancient people knew uncertainty. They watched carefully because the difference between too little, enough, and too much mattered. But for many communities across much of ancient Egyptian history, the flood remained one of the great organizing rhythms of life. It shaped agriculture, movement, administration, ritual, memory, and imagination. Tonight, we have stayed away from the noise of famous battles and the glare of royal monuments. We have listened instead for the quieter history of ordinary hands, hands that carried water, shaped clay, tied boats, ground grain, mended linen, held reed pens, cut papyrus, repaired baskets, and pressed seeds into soil after the flood. These lives are harder to name than kings, but they are not less real. They belong to the same river, the same sky, and the same patient turning of seasons. Now the village is settling into night. The lamps grow dim in the doorways. The animals are quiet. The last voices fade from the lane. Out beyond the houses the water reflects a few stars, though it is lower now than before. The fields are returning, dark and soft beneath the night. Somewhere a boat knocks gently against its rope. Somewhere a reed moves in the faint wind. Somewhere the river continues north, carrying silt, memory, and moonlight. And as the Nile moves softly through the darkness, carrying the season onward, we can leave the village to its sleep. The fields will wait until morning. The tools will wait by the wall. The seed baskets will wait in the house. The river will keep its old rhythm a little longer. Let your own thoughts grow quiet now, like water settling after the pole is lifted away. Rest well, wherever you are listening from. Good night. Perhaps the most restful part of this story is that it does not end with a single triumph. It ends with continuation. The flood rises, rests, withdraws, and leaves the people to begin again. No one person owns the rhythm. A ruler may claim order, a priest may praise abundance, a scribe may record measures, a farmer may prepare seed, and a child may remember the sight of water over the fields. The river holds all these meanings without needing to explain itself. When we think of ancient Egypt, it is easy to picture stone temples, stone statues, stone tombs, stone inscriptions, stone faces looking across time. But flood season asks us to picture softer things: mud, reeds, water, grain, linen, baskets, bread, smoke, animal breath, and damp soil. These materials do not always survive as proudly as stone, yet they were the texture of living. A civilization is not made only by what endures in museums. It is also made by what was used up, eaten, mended, carried, and worn thin. There is a gentle loneliness in imagining the village after everyone has gone indoors. We know the people are gone from history as individuals, most of their names lost. We cannot ask them what they feared, what they hoped, what joke made them laugh beside the river, or what dream came to them during Akhet. Yet the river lets us come near. It shows us the shape of their year. It helps us understand why a jar mattered, why a rope mattered, why a mark on a stone mattered, why a field under water was not empty. The night deepens. The temple wall is dark. The storehouse door is closed. The boat rope holds. The reeds move once, then settle. In a house on higher ground, a child sleeps under a piece of linen. On the roof, someone turns over and listens to frogs in the distance. The fields lie quiet, half water and half returning earth. Above them, the stars are patient. They have watched many seasons pass, and they will watch this one pass too. So we leave the Nile Valley without trying to possess it. We leave it as a place of human labour and natural rhythm, of careful records and unrecorded lives, of sacred thanks and practical repair. We leave it with the water moving softly northward, the soil darkening under night, and the village resting between memory and morning. Good night. If you are still awake, let the final image be very simple. A line of dark water, a few stars trembling on its surface, and a village breathing quietly on higher ground. Nothing urgent remains for tonight. The counting can wait. The planting can wait. The boat can wait. Even the river, though it never stops moving, seems calm enough to carry your thoughts away slowly. The past does not need to be loud to be close. Sometimes it comes nearest in the sound of water at night. Long after our imagined lamps go out, the season continues without narration. Damp soil dries by degrees. Footprints harden. Seeds swell. A boat leaves at first light. Someone opens a jar. Someone checks a boundary. Someone laughs at a child covered in mud. These moments will not be carved in stone, but they are the life for which the monument stood in the background. The old world was built from ordinary mornings as much as from extraordinary rains, and if sleep is coming now, there is nothing more to hold. Let the river take the measurements, the memories, the footsteps, and the fading lantern light. Let the village remain where it is, far away and safe in the imagination, while the water moves through the night with no need for hurry. The story has reached its bank. Good night.
Thank you for watching Something About Sleep. Since you're clearly still awake, why don't you click on the next video and we'll see you there.